Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive, and today I'm interviewing Nick Gordon about Vermeer's painting, The Milkmaid. Since 2006, Nick has designed over 70 cultural tours to Western Europe, Asia and Australia, and he's frequently invited to lecture on art history and technique to organisations such as the Australian Decorative and Fine Arts Society and the Justin Art House Museum in Melbourne. And as an artist, Nick has a unique perspective on the fascinating technique, style and legacy of Johannes Vermeer, one of Western art's most celebrated but mystifying painters. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Kathleen.
Thanks very much for coming in today to talk to us about Vermeer's painting, The Milkmaid. And before we talk a little more about the history and the style and technique of this painting, could you please describe to us the painting that we're talking about?
Well, we're looking at what is ultimately a very small painting. It's only 45 by 41 centimetres, but it takes us right into the world of a domestic servant. So what we're looking at is, in the centre, the milkmaid with that brilliant yellow and blue outfit with those green things going up her arms, which are arm guards. They're stuff to help prevent your sleeves getting dirty while you're doing kind of the business of keeping a house running. And she's pouring milk from one earthenware jar into an earthenware pot. In front of that pot is a whole big pile of stale bread on the table. And that stale bread will be mixed with the milk to effectively make a very kind of frugal bread and butter pudding. As we look around this painting, we notice there are all sorts of everyday household objects. So behind her on the right-hand side, there is a small wooden box with holes in it on the floor. That's something you would put the coals in. You would get embers or coals inside that box, and maids would sit over it or stand over it so the heat on a cold winter's morning would kind of rise up through their skirts to keep their legs warm. You can see that she's cold. When you look at her hands are red from the cold. Her face is also slightly red from the cold as well. When you look up to the other side, to the left-hand side of the painting, you see a bread basket. So this is the sort of basket that would be slung over a maid's shoulder as she went to market to pick up went to the baker to pick up the family's bread for a few days. And then on the far left, you have this wonderful window where the light comes in and flows down across over the milkmaid's face, over her arms. But each of these objects all guide us in towards that central, very, very thin trail of milk from the jug into the pot beneath. So it's a wonderfully still and silent painting that guides our attention all to this very thin trail of milk running into a pot.
Silent, I think, is a lovely word to describe something about the mood of Vermeer in general. There does always seem to be a stillness and a softness in his works. What do you think it is that gives that quality to Vermeer's paintings?
It's partly his skill in composition, I think. So in a Vermeer, nothing is out of place. And we know from looking at the underpaintings or kind of the pentimenti in his works that he would change things, modify things to make sure that they were exactly in their right place. So in this case, part of that stillness comes from these two diagonals between the box on the floor that runs up from lower right to upper left to the bread basket, and then the other diagonal that runs through the gaze of the milkmaid, who is not looking at us. She's looking down at that stream of milk. It runs through her gaze, it runs through the direction of her right arm, which is holding the milk jug, and it terminates in that whole loaf of bread in a basket. So these diagonals draw our attention into the centre of the painting.
There's also a real sense of absorption in, I think, a lot of works by Vermeer, actually. There's a sense of people being very much focused on what it is that they're doing and not necessarily engaging with we, the viewers, as much as in some other kinds of paintings where people look out at us. And there's also a sense that nothing here is extraneous. So those carefully chosen objects that you've described, are they simply components of what's essentially a still life, or is there something deeper going on in this painting of a woman essentially making bread pudding?
Well, one of the things that I think attracts people to Vermeer is even in relatively simple scenes, or for example, in other works of his, which were genre scenes, things that were painted, things that were a dime a dozen in the Golden Age. But what distinguishes Vermeer, I think, is where he draws us into the work somehow and wants us to contemplate some sort of meaning behind it that's often just outside, just beyond reach. So in this way, his works are like a great play. Kind of they draw you in, but once you start talking to someone and trying to figure out what it means, you find that you just have this plethora of meanings growing up around the work. So in this case here, just to give you an idea of some of the different associations people have brought out with this painting, we firstly get ideas of the honesty of labour and frugality. This idea of kind of a Dutch Protestantism, that this is, although this is a middle-class family, this is the humble work that's taking place, and the owners of the household will also eat humble bread pudding because it's frugal, nothing goes to waste, waste not, want not, etc. But we also have attached to that ideas of domesticity, and Vermeer is a great painter of female domestic space. And you might notice as you look around Vermeer's works, the majority of the people he paints are women. So he is a very great and very sensitive painter of women. But then you have a very different interpretation of this work, and that's on the idea of the milkmaid being a type of an alluring sexual object. So you even have one modern scholar who talks about the alluring quality of the flesh of her forearms, where her sleeve has been pulled up, revealing the paler flesh that doesn't get exposed to sunlight because it's usually under a sleeve. And that same scholar might then look at the foot warmer and then say, well, that's something that projects warmth up the inner side of women's legs up through their skirts. And that same scholar then points to that tile decoration between the milkmaid and that box and points out that it's actually a cupid. So is there an idea of lust, or is there a different sort of trope here of the milkmaid as an alluring sexual object? Now, that scholar's work, and it's more than one person has argued this about Vermeer, is something that I don't think quite necessarily works with this, because so much of this painting is focused not on that little detail. But nonetheless, it's a little set of details in here that allow us to build more meanings around this painting.
So you're kind of describing these opposing views of seeing this painting as being on the one hand about economy and frugality, and on the other hand as some kind of hidden excess or luxury or luxuriousness. And yet when we look at the painting, there is a kind of luxuriousness, but it's really the way for me in which Vermeer lavishes so much attention on fine detail. And you've told us that this is quite a small painting. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through perhaps how it is in terms of his technique that Vermeer is able to bring out so much detail with so much economy of size and of scale.
Well, it's mostly in his use of paint, and part of, I think, what creates this lavish quality is that very rich blue that runs through the middle of it. So this is on the maid's apron, which is actually painted with lapis lazuli, which is the most expensive pigment. It's more expensive than gold. And we know that while Vermeer was by no means wealthy, he did kind of splash money on using very high quality, very rare pigments like lapis lazuli. But he's also used that lapis lazuli, which he's mixed with lead white as a glaze over where you look at her sleeves. You can see there's this wonderful purpley blue hue in the shadows of her sleeves, and that's also using lapis lazuli. So he's using a very expensive material, a very luminous material to paint very humble objects. The richness, though, of the painting, particularly when you look to, say, the bread or the maid's face, is coming from a very heavily impastoed use of paint. So it's almost as if he's sculpting the face here rather than painting it. So while the painting looks very, very realistic from a distance, the more you get up close to this work, the more you look at it, the more that kind of detail disappears into quite thick, heavy dabs of paint. The bread in particular, and the maid's face, her arms, The more you look at those, again, you get right close up, and you can do this through with the Rijksmuseum's gigabit image of this work. You can see that just how he's created this with layer after layer of quite heavy, thick impastoed paint, and then these very fine glazes of things like the lapis lazuli to give that richness of colour behind it.
The other thing that Vermeer seems to be in total control of here is light. So the way in which the light comes through that window at our upper left and streams across the bread with all of the texture that you've just described on the bread and illuminates the forearms of the milkmaid, showing us that in fact her hands are so red, raw and cold. The flash of light on that brass-looking object that hangs on the wall at the left next to the bread basket. How would you characterise Vermeer's approach to light in his work?
Well, we know that Vermeer is a master observer of light and how light works. And in this sense, he's not alone. So there is quite a long tradition from Jan van Eyck onwards of Netherlandish painters really analysing, really looking closely at how light works, how light bounces off different objects, how it refracts through different types of glass, how it reacts to different surface textures. So that's not unique to Vermeer, but there is another quality in his light that makes his work, I think, stand out a little bit more. And that's partly in the way that he often uses a very, very similar structured room, and he paints over and over light streaming in through a window on the left-hand side. Now, some people have said that this is evidence of him using a camera oscura. His understanding of light in this sense probably isn't. So the difficulty about using a camera oscura is it can give you the outlines of something from a distance, but to use it you have to be in the dark, so you can't actually paint with a camera oscura. It's kind of, you'd be painting in the dark, in which case you couldn't get your colours right. So it can only ever be used for an outline. And for something that is defined by line, you can't then use that for light. Light is created through painterly effect rather than through line. So in this case here, he's studying light and light, how it works. But it seems that from some of his other works, such as The View of Delft, he's actually looking at the world through lenses, looking at the world through telescopes. And there are effects of light that only come about when you look at the world through a lens. And that seems to be part of his practice, his study of light, the study of how the world appears to us, that he then brings into his mind, he understands it, and then it appears in odd ways in his work. So when you look through a lens, you get something called halation, where you get kind of the appearance of dabs of light or little halos of light around certain objects. And if you look closely at the bread in this work, those dabs of paint look like a very similar effect, something you would see if you looked at the world through a lens. So in this case, for the painting, he probably hasn't looked at through a lens to create the painting, but he's very familiar with looking at the world through a lens. If he were alive today, he'd be playing around with mobile phone cameras.
I think one of the things many of us know about Vermeer is that not many of his works survive, that there's a limited number of Vermeers in the world, and I think that does exercise a little bit of a fascination on us as viewers, that we know we're looking at something quite rare and precious, and yet he is acknowledged as one of the greatest painters in the Western canon. So I wonder if to wrap up for us, if you might say something about the impact of Vermeer in his own time, how he was received by patrons and viewers of art in his own lifetime, and how you would describe his legacy for Western painting.
Well, in his own life, we know that he was respected by his fellow painters. He'd been a guild member, he'd been a head of the guild, he'd been called up to The Hague to be the assessor of a bunch of works that the royal family were wanting to buy. But as a painter, he was never really successful in his own life. It seems that he painted very, very few works. He took, as you can see, a laborious amount of time to create works like this. He did sell some, not many. And it seems that just at the time he was about to start making money, when things were beginning to improve, he suddenly died. He then falls into kind of relative obscurity for then hundreds of years, where his work is often misattributed to being somebody else's. And it's not really until the later 19th and early 20th century where his reputation as a painter is recovered. And then we have in the later 20th century, when we start looking more at his work, we start looking at Vermeer and seeing, well, this is a man who is very interested in the actual science of optics. And that appeals to our understanding today that science and art interact with one another. And when we look more at this work here, you start seeing other things that I think appeal to us today, such as Vermeer being a very sensitive painter of women and female domestic spaces. So we know that Vermeer lived in a house of women. He lived with his mother-in-law, Maria Tins, his wife, his daughters, and the humble milkmaid. And in this case here, the milkmaid might actually be the household maid, a woman called Tanneke. And she, I think, interests us today because she appears in court documents as a defender of both Maria Tins, Vermeer's mother-in-law, along with Vermeer's wife, against Vermeer's brother-in-law, who happened to be, it seems, an incredibly violent alcoholic who kept turning up at the house, physically beating up the women of the household, threatening Vermeer's wife at one point with a stick with a nail in it when she was heavily pregnant. And Tanneke appears in the court documents as somebody who is physically defending the family against this violent alcoholic man before eventually they have enough evidence that gets him locked away in an asylum somewhere. So I think kind of the more we look at Vermeer, both as somebody who understands the beauty of light, but also the science of light, the beauty of composition, but also the mathematics behind the composition, I think we also see somebody who can capture the beauty of a person's appearance, but also convey something to us of their essential nature. In this case, the quiet, humble strength of the milkmaid.
Thanks very much, Nick.
You're welcome, Kathleen.
You've been listening to Limelight-Arts-Travel's podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.